Hello, John Muchler here, pastor at the Ferndale Alliance Church, and we are taking our last look at Matthew chapter 5, verse 13, when Jesus looks at his disciples. He looks at us and he says that you are the salt of the earth. And there is an emphasis on the word you in the Greek. You are the salt of the earth. And he goes on and he says, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. We've looked at the benefits of salt and we suggested how that would apply to the Christian life. Salt improves things. It improves the taste of things. And so we are to improve the world around us. It preserves things. It makes things last. It brings about benefits for the long term. We even commented on the fact that Jesus hasn't come back yet after 2,000 years. He could easily come back today. I don't know any reason he couldn't come back before this video is completed. He could come back at any time, but since he hasn't, he has put us here to be a salting, positive, beneficial influence on the world. Salt increases thirst. It's a thirst maker, and we suggested that we as believers are to inspire a thirst for righteousness in other people. Salt brings healing. It's put on wounds intentionally, and even though it hurts sometimes, it eventually brings healing. We suggest that sometimes the Christian message can be painful to hear the news that we are lost sinners, that we need Christ, but that pain, that grief eventually turns to joy as we are healed in Christ. It's also used in the Old Testament for purification rituals. When people came to the temple or to the altar with their sacrifices, salt was included in that ritual. And it brings about purity. Purity is something we understand in terms of water. Salt is used in the purification of water. The walt will take out the impurities, and then you use what's called a reverse osmosis system to draw the salt or draw the water out of the salt away from the water. There's an interesting Old Testament story about the prophet Elijah. Elijah was the protege of Elijah, and oddly enough, Elijah gets the credit for having the most recorded miracles in the Old Testament, and one of them was when he was at Jericho. The community leaders in Jericho complained about, it's a great place to live, great location, but the water stinks, and so Elijah performed a miracle by pouring salt in the source of water to make it pure again. One of those great Old Testament miracles. And so salt is really important, and it's a great metaphor for the Christian. But what if the salt loses its saltiness? That's what our passage says. What can you do with it? How can you make it salty again? Oddly enough, the word saltiness, in terms of losing its saltiness, is not in the Greek. It's the word, we get the word moron. Later on, when Jesus says you shouldn't kill, but if you call your brother a fool, it's the word moron. And I think it more has the idea of worthlessness. And when we call somebody a moron, we're basically saying, you're just worthless. You're worthless to me. You're worthless to the world. And so salt can become worthless somehow. Now, salt as a chemical, it's very stable, and it will always taste like salt. But what happens is it gets contaminated. It gets filled with impurities, and that's what makes it worthless. And so for the Christian, it's having too much stuff in us that doesn't look like Jesus, that doesn't look like spirit-filled living. So we're salty, but our salt is worthless when it becomes, like real salt, becomes contaminated. Too much of the world, too much of the flesh, too much of the devil. And we're reminded once again that Jesus says that we are in the world, but we're not of the world. Another way to put it is that though we are in the world should not be in us. We're in the world, but much of the world should not be in us. Now, when I think about worthless salt that's not very appealing to me, I think about the salt that is used along roadways or in roadways to decrease icing. And interesting what it does, salt does not melt the ice, but it lowers the temperature point of freezing from about 32 degrees Fahrenheit as low as 15 degrees Fahrenheit. So when the road crews get out there, their goal is to get the salt on the road before the snow. So then when the rain comes and the snow comes, it's a lower freezing point. It's kept from freezing. And also, it's used to provide some friction. It's like any mineral. And so back in the time of Jesus Christ, when salt was worthless, it was contaminated, it didn't taste good anymore because it had stuff in it, it was tossed out. It was just tossed out in the street along with just about everything else. And what happened to it? It was trampled underfoot. It was very common. You just have salt and you realize it wasn't useful anymore. Maybe it had been used to preserve meat. It was overused. It was impure. They would just toss it out, and so it became part of the pathway. That was all that was useful for, was to become part of the trail, part of the road, part of the pathway. And so I want to suggest that even worthless salt, tasteless salt, can be used for something, even if it's just tossed out by the side of the road for people to walk on so they don't slip and fall. And I think there's an interesting, I'm going to stretch it a bit here, there's an interesting biblical principle that God still uses godless people, disobedient people, rebellious people, people who want nothing to do with God to fulfill his purposes. Think of how God used Satan in the book of Job. He basically manipulated Satan to create this challenge, to create this test that Job passed to demonstrate that a person could still love and trust God even when things went terribly horrible in their lives. How about Pharaoh? Here's a guy who wanted nothing to do with God, did not want to let the people go under Moses, and so God used Pharaoh. If you read the story carefully, God used Pharaoh's disobedience to bring about God's glory in delivering Israel from Egypt. Even in the New Testament, God used the betrayal, the deceit, the greed of Judas who betrayed Jesus. That became part of God's plan to save and redeem the earth. So you are the salt of the earth. But if you lose your saltiness, if you become worthless, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything but to be trampled underfoot. So go be the salt of the earth. Go and be the salt of the earth.